All right, howdy everybody, and welcome to Friday Night Figma. Except this Friday evening, we're not going to be discussing anything in Figma exactly, although I did make this slide deck in Figma. This evening, we are going to go over the basics of moderated usability testing, and I do mean the very basics of moderated usability testing in that I'm not going to discuss anything besides the high level concepts of usability testing, that is to say, when you want to test, who you want to test, how you find applicants, things like that. And so, if there are any questions that are more in the weeds, feel free to drop me a message via Twitch. We have the chat going, and you can also find me on Skype, Discord, and Slack in the appropriate educational track channels. So, in any event, let's go ahead and dive right in. And so, yes, moderated usability testing. And the first question is, what is the point of doing any sort of testing, any sort of usability testing? And the point of usability testing is to make sure design decisions you have made are valid and work for your users. And I will use that term valid and validation a couple of times throughout this slide deck. And another word for usability testing is validation. And the idea is any concept you come up with or any design practice you want to go with needs to be tested. It needs to be validated. You need to know whether or not the idea is valid, because the idea is, of course, you are trying to design something for others, for users, and you want to make sure that the decisions that you make are in line with what they want and what they need. And sometimes those two are different things, and we may discuss that briefly. And so another way to think about that is every decision that you make as far as design is concerned is essentially a hypothesis about it's what you think is going to happen versus what is actually going to happen in reality, in real life, when actual users begin to use your product. Because regardless of how good of an idea you think something is, it might turn out not to be such a great idea. And I've the more the further you get into UX, the more you will understand that to be a truth. That is to say, just because you, as the designer, think something is a fantastic idea, and that everyone will immediately understand how it works, or immediately understand how to accomplish a goal or a task, that is not always the case, and sometimes it's the complete opposite scenario. And so, all of these design decisions are hypotheses, and you're checking, you're validating, you're testing your hypotheses through a series of tests. And as one of the first things UX students are taught is the false consensus effect, or consensus bias. And that is, consensus bias is a way of thinking in that since you're designing something, you're assuming that it's correct and that everyone's going to, again, understand it, know how it works, and know how to accomplish a certain task, regardless of whatever that task may be. However, you are not the user. And again, just because you come up with a fantastic idea, it needs to be tested to make sure that it actually is a fantastic idea. And we will go over in the next slides how to go about doing that. And so just always keep in mind, you are not the user. So the first question is, okay, so I'm not the user. I understand that. Who is the user? Who do we choose to test? Whether we're testing out, you might be testing a prototype, low fidelity, high fidelity, probably more on the low fidelity side, maybe a wireframe that you put together, or you're merely testing out an idea. Let's say you haven't put pen to paper, or you haven't really designed anything yet, and you're trying to field interest in an idea. Well, regardless of what stage you are in whether you're in the planning stage or you're in a stage where you're actively, you're creating, you've made deliverables or you're making a prototype, regardless of the stage, you need to make sure that you are speaking to the correct people, that you're interviewing or running tests with the appropriate user base. And so the question here is, who do we test? And so ideally, the users testing your product should reflect the actual user base. And for example, here, if you are working on a video game app, or something to do with streaming, or something in that domain, and or for example, in this image that I found, if you are a UX tester, or if you're doing UX research for Twitch, for example, you'll want to make sure that the users that you choose to test are users of your product already, if it already exists, or users of a similar, possibly competing product. And in this case, if you're designing for a video game product, you'll want to find users who could conceivably use your app. So if you're doing research for Twitch, you would want to find users to do research with who are gamers, or who stream a lot, other things. I'm using Twitch, and I don't game on Twitch. However, I would be an example of someone who would be a decent person, a decent candidate for usability testing, because I'm familiar with the various systems. I've used other streaming platforms before, and so I would come in to the test with a certain amount of knowledge relating to the topic, and that's going to be fairly useful. And to illustrate an example of someone or a type of user that you may not want to recruit into your testing would be, let's see here, it's actually a bit hard to see here. If you are testing, for example, an insurance application for vehicle owners, or people who drive very frequently, and in this example I chose Geico, you may not want to choose individuals, or you may want to screen out, and we'll get to that shortly, individuals who do not own vehicles, or in another category, another cohort of individuals who would never use this app and may not be familiar with any of the topics that you would be bringing up and discussing, or may not be familiar with any of the goals or tasks that you might try to have them accomplish if they're working through a prototype of yours, for example. And this isn't always necessarily the case, and you'll want to have some specificity when you're looking for users. However, you won't always, depending on what type of user you're looking for, you won't always have the luxury of being able to pick and choose. It'll depend on exactly, again, who you're looking for, and so that can be difficult sometimes. Oftentimes, well, depending on the type of product that you're working on, it can be fairly easy to find users, and other times it could be fairly difficult. And yes, so that brings us to our next slide. How do we find these users? Once we have an idea of what they look like and the behaviors or attitudes that they have that would be attractive to us as the people who would, the moderators in this test, how do we find them? And so that is sort of going back to what I said a minute ago. The more specific the user is, the more difficult and costly it's going to be to recruit them. And I put not the most scientific chart in the world, but on the left side here, I have free and relatively inexpensive and easy to find. And on the right side, we have expensive and hard to find. And so depending on what type of product you're looking for, again, it could be a challenge, or you could find users with relative ease. And so if you are doing, again, for example, I use the photo more than once here. If you are trying to find gamers, or those who stream, or at least familiar with streaming, those could be fairly easy to find depending on what your network looks like. And I picked this image at the very top here, or on top of the gamer image, of an individual who is at the market, who is doing some shopping. And I am in the middle of doing some usability testing for an e-commerce website. And it was fairly easy to find users for that in my network, which is essentially, I don't really use LinkedIn for these sorts of things. I certainly could. However, I'm on Discord, Slack, and Skype, and the cohort that I was looking for included essentially people who shop online, who are familiar with finding items at at a retailer and familiar with checkout processes. And so that's a lot of people. And so it's fairly easy for me to find for this capstone this body of users. I will say for for my first capstone, I was focusing on individuals in the disabled community. And so my ability to locate these users was lessened. It was much worse. I had a very difficult time finding the number of users that I needed to find, and it took significantly longer to do that test for a number of reasons. But one of the big reasons was it was just difficult to find these people. And so bear in mind going forward, you may need to, depending on what sort of people you're looking for, you may need to dedicate more time or money or other form of resource to put toward finding the appropriate users. And so, generally speaking, the more specific and the rarer the person is going to be accordingly difficult to find them. And so if you're doing usability testing and you really need, for example, billionaires, as we have here, Musk, Gates, Bezos, and Zuckerberg, if you need to interview people like that or have them usability test, that's going to be incredibly difficult and possibly impossible, depending on who you are and how you're trying to test. And astronauts and other, if you're testing for astronauts or people who are unique in some sense, or there's fewer than 500 or so of them living, it may be incredibly difficult to find them. And then in the middle, I have doctors, and this is meant to be an attorney, and they can certainly be found. However, one issue we need to focus on briefly is the expense involved. And as stated or as written here on the left, in this case, I'll not to be demeaning, but your everyday consumer, relatively, again, easy to find, same thing with gamers, and it's either going to be free or fairly inexpensive to recruit these folks into your testing. And the harder to find folks, or the folks who have careers that pay very well, you're going to need to start incentivizing your testing. And so as far as the category of folks on the left, and just so we're clear, by no means do I mean to indicate that your physician here might not also be a gamer. However, depending on exactly what you're testing for, you will recruit people from different categories, so to speak. And so when you have your individuals on the left here who are easier to find, you sometimes can get away, depending on how long the test is and what sort of hoops they have to jump through to accomplish the test, you can get away with not offering anything, really. It would be nice to offer some sort of compensation, especially when you're in a more professional field. It's more common to offer some form of compensation no matter who you're getting to test. But if you're testing with individuals who might fall into a category here on the left, a $5, $10, $20 Starbucks gift card might be just absolutely perfect as a form of compensation. However, the further you get to the right, you need to take into account that these individuals, and I suppose I'll focus on the attorneys and the doctors, make or have the potential to make well over six figures per year. And so their time is not that anyone's time is more or less valuable than another's. However, by taking them away from their jobs or having them do something that they wouldn't normally do, you'll need to compensate them. And your compensation per tester is going to go up, possibly tremendously, depending on who you're testing. A general practitioner versus a cardiologist, for example, you might need to consider increasing your compensation depending on, again, how specific you are with your testing. And it's as far as how to find these people, once you've identified who you need to, as far as finding them, my first, and again, this won't work for everyone, and of course, depending on who you're looking to find, this may or may not work, but check your personal network. And you very often, for example, in Slack, Discord, and Skype, I have many friends who are there and who chat back and forth on a daily basis.
And so it's fairly easy with a network like that to find candidates who fit the bill for my at least for my capstone 2. And so check your network, and you may be surprised sometime to find out that someone you know online, who you take to be one type of person, might actually something they might have an attribute about them that you were unaware of that might make them the perfect candidate to be tested. And so check your network that you're already in and go from there, and then expand out from there. And of course, anything past that I can't really comment on. I've never had to recruit attorneys, doctors, billionaires, or astronauts. And I know that there are certainly companies out there, groups of UX researchers, who can do that work for you. However, as far as testing is concerned, testing doesn't need to be expensive. And indeed, as we see here on the left, testing can be free. And so try to keep it as cheap as possible, or as inexpensive as possible, I should say, bearing in mind that's going to be dependent on the cohort that you're looking to test with. And as I mentioned here on the screen, screeners are useful. And so what are screeners? Screeners are, it is what it says on the tin. They screen, they filter out users. Typically, this is done in the form of a survey. And so a survey that you as the UX researcher will write. And so you'll write a survey, and then you will release that survey into the wild, into your various networks, whatever that looks like. And users will fill out the screener, again, often in the form of a survey, and they'll submit all their answers, all their information, and then that information will be collected by whatever screener service you use, and then you'll be able to, after a couple of hours or a couple of days or maybe even weeks or months, you'll be able to look at the answers from the screened users and determine which user might be an appropriate fit for your test. And I did look briefly before I started this stream to see if I could find any other well-known or decent screening creation app or software, and I'm guessing that I was just probably using the wrong search query, because there has to be loads of them out there. But the one that I use is Google Forms, and Google Forms allows you to create surveys for free. You can create as many as you want and disseminate them as you see fit. And let's see here, I believe I made this a link. Ah, yes, I did. And so just to show you briefly how Google Forms work, it's part of the Google Docs family of applications. And so when you're in Google Docs, you just go to the main menu, the hamburger menu, and you have the 4 options here: Docs, Sheets, Slides, or Forms. And if you go to Forms, it looks like this here. And of course, they have various templates available to get you quickly started in the creation of a survey. And I also have a couple of forms down here that I was working with, and I want to just give you a very brief glimpse into how these work. And so in Google Forms, you have the ability to come up with, or you can devise your surveys any number of ways, and you can ask, of course, any number of questions. You can integrate checkboxes or radio buttons, and depending on, of course, the type of question you're asking. And so, for example, I have a question here: what resources do you use to find information about businesses? And we have Yelp, Google Reviews, Eater, TripAdvisor, OpenTable, and then Other, wherein the user could type in their own answer. And below that, got all over the place there. And then below that, how often do you find missing, incomplete, or false information about accessibility and usability relating to a business? And here, instead of checkboxes, I use radio buttons, because only one of these answers would be appropriate at the time. And since I'm in edit mode, it would allow me to write any question I wanted to. And of course, I can attach images to these various answer radio buttons, and I can change it from what type of answer it is: multiple choice answer, checkboxes if users want to select more than one answer, and short answer paragraph where a user can type in their own answer. There's also a linear scale, so there's sort of a slider where a user could indicate what percentage possibly that they felt about something. There's also various grids, dates, times, so on and so forth. So it's fairly powerful. You can get a lot done with a Google Forms screener, I should say. And it also, of course, collects email. And so, which is very important at the end when you are, when you're done with your screener, you can take a look at everyone who participated in the survey and then select the users that you think might be a good fit and then email them or get in touch with them another way. And another very powerful, very cool aspect of Google Forms is at the top here, it says responses. And if you click responses, we can see, get rid of that, at the very top, it has a list of individuals who have completed the survey as well as their email addresses. And it based on each question, depending on the answer type, multiple choice, radio buttons, things of that nature. Multiple choice, checkboxes, linear scale, things of that nature. It will produce a graph for you, and based on it'll show you percentages of answers. And so here we have a pie graph of the various responses that we have broken into percentages. We have a bar graph here, and we have another sort of bar graph here, and this is sort of just very. Its usefulness will depend on what sort of information you're gathering. However, these are just awesome for metrics. And then I have some short answers here. One of the questions was answered in the form of a short answer, and so users wrote a sentence or two. And then I have the final question down here, which is, if selected, would you be able to schedule an interview? And it looks like 88.2% of the respondents to my survey said yes, they would be willing to be interviewed. And I was conducting interviews at the time. I was doing some primary research. And so you can get a lot of fantastic information for not a tremendous amount of work in Google Forms. And of course, it's fairly customizable. You can change the background color. You can change the image up here. And so there's a lot to be done here. Very, very powerful stuff. And so Google Forms is a pretty quick and easy way to create a screener. And as I said, I was unable to find any other screening software or software that allows you to make surveys. However, there has to be a million of them out there. And so all you need to do is go to your favorite search engine and form a query and search that way. In any event, on to the next slide. And so this is a very interesting one. And even though I now know this to be true after having done so much testing, I'm still amazed that this is actually the case. And the subject of this slide is, how many people do I need to test with? And of course, as with everything in user experience, the answer is, that depends. However, I wish I knew the name of this type of curve here. I'm sure there is a name. And I looked for it briefly, and I found the equation, or the y equals mx plus b type thing for this type of curve, but I didn't see it. I didn't see if it actually had a formal name, which I'm sure there is. But if we examine this graph a little bit here, on the bottom we have the x-axis, which is the label for the x-axis is number of test users, and the label for the y-axis is usability problems found, which is based in percentages, whereas the x is just number of users. And we can see that even at the first user, which would be somewhere around here, even the first user is going to find 25, maybe even 30% of all usability problems. And that is a staggering amount for just the first user. And then same thing with the second. You're looking like you almost double, just a little bit below, but almost double the amount of issues found. And then after that, you start facing a steep fall off, a steep drop off in the number of usability issues found as the number of users increases in your testing regimen. And the most commonly given answer for how many users do I test with is 5. And if we look here, I wish they had numbered this a bit differently instead of going by 3. However, 5 is about right here, which corresponds to roughly 80% of the number of usability problems identified. And we can see that after 5, of course, you'll still continue to find errors. However, it's going to be at a much lower rate. And of course, you can also view the x-axis going to the right as an increase in time and cost and any other resources involved in your usability testing. And so that's something to be very sensitive of if you don't have a great deal of money to run usability testing, or if you're doing it, if you're doing free usability testing where you're not compensating people, you're going to run into a problem eventually where the same users, or sorry, every user that you interview is going to be repeating something that a previous user has said as far as a usability concern or usability error is concerned. And so 5 is generally accepted to be a pretty good number to shoot for. And that's, of course, going to be completely dependent on what you're testing, who you're testing with, the severity of issues that you're looking for. There's any number of variables that are going to go into shaping how many users you need to get some really good testing done. However, and this is a quote from Jacob Nielsen from this very same page, the most striking truth of the curve is that 0 users give 0 insights. And that is, it may be obvious after the fact, after having read this quote at the bottom, but that is one of the big truths of usability testing. And this goes back to hypothesis validation. And that is to say, if you do no testing at all, you've essentially learned nothing. And again, that seems like it would go without saying. However, it's going to be, you're not going to have any useful insights, or indeed you might be operating under the same set of incorrect ideas if you do no user testing. And again, just a single user test is going to find a pretty decent amount of usability problems. And so I urge anyone listening or watching to test often and test early, because you want to find these problems as soon as you possibly can. And okay, so after if you chose to create a screener, after you've done that, after you've sent that out to the masses for them to complete, or after you've found your group of people that you want to test, now what? Now how do you proceed? Okay, so you will then need to schedule your testing, and there are many different ways of doing that these days, thankfully. And two of the more popular, the most popular one, or at least the one I was first introduced to, is an app called Calendly. And Calendly allows you to, you go to their website and it brings you to a calendar, and you set up a test. And in the calendar, you tell Calendly, okay, I'm free on this date at this range of times. And it says, okay, and it generates a link for you. You send the link to the people who you want to test with, and they go to Calendly and they will sign up for whatever time block. It can be 15-minute, 30-minute, 1 hour time block, however you set that up, and they'll sign up for it. And when they sign up for it, that time block will then disappear. It's dedicated toward them. You as the moderator, the tester, and the individual who is going to do the testing, they'll both receive an email with a Zoom link, and or possibly maybe a Google Meet or Skype link, whatever the case may be. And it'll say, or the message will say, okay, at this time, please click on the link to join the meeting. And of course, you as the moderator, you will be the meeting host, and so you'll need to have that running a couple of minutes before the scheduled time, just to make sure everything works out okay. And so yeah, Calendly is the most, or it's one of the more popular ones. It does have a few, I say it has downsides. I guess that's just a way of me saying it has downsides is not completely correct. You can only set up one test at a time. That is to say, if you have multiple projects, if you're working on multiple products or projects at once, under the free system, you can't have more than one appointment block ready for people to jump into or to schedule with. You'll need to start paying them if you want to have multiple tests running at once for different things. And that's a bit annoying. And so a good buddy of mine recommended I check out Cron, which I think very recently was just purchased by Notion. And so Notion might integrate Cron. I expect them to integrate Cron into their workflow, or into
into their processes. And so Notion might be a competitor with Calendly coming up, but that is to be seen. And then down here, I have a chart that shows some. I found this chart by doing a Google search for Calendly alternatives, and I found a website with this chart here. And let's see, we'll just go ahead and go to this website. Ooh, if I can click. Yeah, so it looks like it's vocus.io. And top Calendly alternatives, and it's, yeah, meeting scheduling tools is the topic right now. And we have the 8 best Calendly alternatives in this graph that uses a thumbs down for not available, which is confusing when you're looking at this. However, they seem to be, so Sprintful seems to be one of the better ones, or rather, I should say, Sprintful seems to have the most features. And so, one thing that, regardless of whichever one you choose, and that may be dependent on price, of course, but regardless of whichever one you choose, make sure that you choose one with a that has conferencing features built into it. That is to say, it speaks to Zoom, or it has no problem talking directly to Google Meet or whatever conferencing or meeting software that you may use. And so at the bottom we have Zoom integration, and every single one of these offers Zoom integration. And some of them, it looks like about half of them, offer Google Meet integration. Zoom obviously is the most, well, not obviously, Zoom is the most popular online conferencing and meeting app right now. And so that is going to be the one that developers develop for first when they're creating meeting scheduling apps. So you're likely to see that more often. And this does not list every single one of them. I noticed that Cron isn't on here, but Cron I don't think is well known yet. And of course, Calendly is not mentioned on here because it's a list of alternatives. Although it would be nice to have had Calendly on here just for to know what we're measuring against. And so let's see here. I'll go ahead and close that. Go back to here, and then I'll just give you an indication of what Calendly looks like. So this is Calendly's front page, or homepage, I should say. And so you can, of course, there's a scheduling plugin available for Chrome, and the micro copyright might change depending on which browser you visit this site in. It could be Firefox or Microsoft Edge or whatever the case may be. But you would go to your account after logging in. You can log in with Google, of course. And here we have we can see 2 of my bookings that I've created, and one was for its informal UX discussion, where I was going to do an informal interview with some UX professionals, and this one on the right here is a wireframe usability test, which is what I set up for my Capstone 2 wireframe testing. However, when I was setting this up, my good friend told me about Cron and gave me an invite, and so I've been using that in lieu of Calendly so far, and it's been working out all right. I don't want to give you too much information about Cron, of course, because it's invite only right now. And of course, if you would like an invite to see how Cron works, you can message me about that, and we'll get that together. And of course, these are both turned off. As you can see here, we have buttons that say turn on. You can only have one of these bookings live at once, and that is one of the limitations of having the free membership. So again, if you felt like if you had enough testing going on, or your company would pay for it, you could have numerous bookings available going on. And you can of course, you can edit them in any number of ways. You can have invitee questions, cancellation policy, notifications, confirmation page, payments if payments are being collected, and then you can indicate the date range that you're available to do the testing, the duration of the test, and then a schedule that indicates the available hours that you can test with. And so I have my my afternoon to early morning, afternoon to late night testing hours available here. And so people would go to Calendly, select a time block that works for them. It would be reserved for them. I would get a Zoom link, or I would get a notification. That user who signed up for it would get a Zoom link. When the time comes, I would start the Zoom meeting, and then we would do the usability testing that way.
And so that was sort of an overview of some of the meeting scheduling applications and sites that are available when you are doing your user testing and trying to get everyone on the same page. So once you've done that, it is time to test. And this is by far the funnest aspect of this. And so when you're testing, you'll want to use software that allows you to view the user's screen while they are, and this is moderated testing, moderated usability testing we're talking about. You'll want to use an app or software that allows you to view the screen sharing of your usability tester. So you can watch them as they work. You can watch where their mouse goes or their pointer and sort of get an idea of what it looks like for them, and you can track them as they use it. And it's again just invaluable. I couldn't even imagine what it would be like not being able to see the user's screen while they're working on accomplishing a goal or a task that I've set for them. And this is a screenshot of, this is actually a test I did earlier today. This right here on there, and this is Zoom if you're not familiar with it. And this individual on the right, this is a stock photo. The actual person's photo is below this photo. But one thing to keep in mind, whenever you are presenting information about usability tests, as I'm doing here, or if you're writing a case study and you're including screenshots of usability testing, you'll want to, well, first and foremost, you want to make sure you have permission to take screenshots and to record. And just out of, if nothing else, etiquette, if not law, you'll want to make sure that everyone says okay to being recorded. And when more to the point, when you're sharing or giving a presentation like this, you will want to, in as much as you can, and in as much as the permission form, if you use one, says you can, you want to protect, or you want to anonymize the people who did the usability testing. So I would like to, I chose the stock image rather than the actual image underneath it, so as to protect the anonymity of the people who test for me. And I will zoom in a bit here. And so, and this can look any number of ways, but this is how I have my system set up. So I can view and this is from the webcam on the user's end. I can see the user here, and then I see what they see on their screen. And here, this user opened up the prototype link that I sent in Chrome, and of course, I made sure my prototype is working and all that good stuff beforehand. And then I can see this. This is not part of the prototype. This gray ellipse, this gray circle at the bottom, that indicates to me where the user's mouse pointer is, and so I can watch the mouse pointer move around, and it's sort of, in a way, a shortcut for what they're thinking about at any given point, because often users will move their mouse pointer, or they'll move their cursor to something, talk about it, and then move it somewhere else. It sort of gives me an idea of what they're thinking about at what point. And it also lets me know if they click on something or if they tap on something and an expected action doesn't work, I know exactly what they were tapping on or what they were clicking on, and how to go about fixing that, or exactly what I need to fix. And so I always record my meetings, and of course I always ask for permission first, and I always I always record them. And there are a number of reasons to do that. When I first started out doing usability testing, I recorded with permission, and I also had a pad and a pen, and I was taking notes as I was giving the tasks to the user to accomplish. And I found out after the case, because when I was writing the case study, or when I was coming up with when I was synthesizing the research here, or synthesizing the findings from the usability testing, I found out that because I was also taking notes at the same time of the recording and while I was giving tasks, I wasn't keeping an eye on the user the whole time. Neither the user nor the screen. And I found out after reviewing some of the recordings that there were things that I had missed because I wasn't paying 100% attention to the user. They said a few things that just went in one ear out the other, and I wasn't able to write it down because you're writing at a very quick pace when you're doing it live. And also, so these days, because of everything that's going on, it's not so easy to do in-person testing, which would be preferable, of course, but for, again, various reasons, it's often easier to do your moderated testing online. And so I test with people who are all over the United States, and it would be preferable to do it in person, of course, in my opinion, because you can more finely analyze their nonverbal communication, and so they'll say a lot about the screen that they're looking at with again, nonverbals, body position, you know, what they're doing, you know, what their countenance looks like, things of that nature. And so you do miss a bit of that by not being there in person, but you miss all of it. Or let me try that again. I miss all of it when I'm taking notes while this is happening. And so I find that if I just hit record and put the notepad away, it's within arm's reach in case there's something I really quickly need to write down, or is very super important that I don't want to at all risk of not writing down later, which is, again, has never happened. But I take my notes when I'm doing a review of the recording. So my attention is 100% on the testing and the user while I'm actually in the middle of doing the testing. And then later on, when I look at when I watch the recordings in QuickTime, I'm able to take notes then, and it frees me from having to worry about missing something in the moment or not paying attention to the user's body language, things of that nature. And that certainly isn't a rule. And as far as this is concerned, test however you would like. Test in ways that make you comfortable and that allow you to get the most information. So whether that means taking notes while you're in the middle of interviewing, or if you know, if able, you might have another UX professional next to you or another UX student who is able to take notes while you're able to concentrate on the user, or you could consider doing it in the method that I use, and that is I don't take any notes until after the fact when I'm recording it. And yeah, that is what works for me. And so this is the point at which you'll have your test script. And excuse me, I did consider goodness gracious, momentarily including information about test scripts and how to write a test script in the stream. However, the more I thought about it, the more ideas I came up with, and I decided that would be better relegated to a stream that's solely focused on coming up with a test script, because there's so much to go into there, and of course I would want to do it right. And so I decided to leave that out. But you would go through your test script at this point and give the user some tasks to accomplish, give them some goals to work toward, and of course you would all of these tasks and goals are based on the hypotheses that you came up with earlier before you wrote your test script. And so your test script, the bulk of the work, or the bulk of the copy in the test script is going to be based on finding the right wording for the task to get the user to confirm or invalidate the hypotheses that you came up with. So that is what you're doing during the actual test. And just a side note about testing. Testing, when it says, I couldn't find a better way to say this, in an educational context, and I don't mean testing for educational products. I mean, if you are a student in a UX program, or if you're in a boot camp or some sort of other educational track where you are around a lot of other students, be that, you know, in an actual physical classroom or virtually, as I'm doing, bear in mind that testing is reciprocal, and reciprocity is the watchword here. The more you test other people's designs, the more willing they're going to be to test yours. And what I mean by that is, well, I'll give you an example with myself. So when I first started my educational track, I am naturally just incredibly introverted, and I don't. It's not that I don't like people, because obviously that's not going to work out. UX is not going to work out for me if that's the case. But I naturally keep to myself. And when I was going through my first capstone, I encountered a lot of difficulty finding people to test for me. And as I mentioned way earlier in slide one, partly that's due to the fact that, or that's because I was looking to interview or have very specific individuals for my usability testing, sort of hard to find individuals. They would be in that little graph I had of the people and difficulty to find versus compensation. They would be further to the right than to the left, and so it was very difficult for me to find people. And I realized after the fact, after I'd done all my testing, that one of the reasons that I was having a difficulty finding people is that I wasn't doing testing for others. And when I did my design sprint, I came up with I developed a new mindset as far as testing is concerned. And so even in toward the end of Capstone 1, when I was working on, say, high fidelity mockups in the case study and going into the design sprint, I was testing for others left and right. I was doing multiple tests per day every week. And there turned out to be a couple of benefits to that. The first one, first and foremost, the reason I did it was because the more people I met, the more testing I did. Very often it's common to sort of trade tests. Like if I test for you, you test for me at some time later on. And I took advantage of that. And not advantage of the people, but advantage of that system that's sort of in place where you test for me, I'll test for you. And so that became a lot easier. And I was able to test my design sprint in 2 days compared to, and it's not exactly apples to apples, but I was able to test in about 2 days everything I needed to do as far as usability testing was concerned in my design sprint versus the 6 weeks it took to do all the testing I needed to do for my first capstone. And of course, the user base was different. However, it cut down on the time spent usability testing just tremendously. And so I tested for every one test I had someone, or I got someone to do for me, I did about 3 or 4 tests for other people. And the other benefit to that, outside of having just a pool of people who you get to know and you can call on for various things that you might need help with, and they'll call on you back and forth. Hey, it's a community, as it turns out. The more testing I did, the more I was able to gauge not exactly where I was, but sort of my skill compared to others. And by no means am I trying to imply that it's a competition. However, it allowed me to see what other designers were doing, and it also gave me a window into how they, their design thinking process and how they came up with things and why they did things. And more than once, I was doing testing for some people when I was going through their high fidelity prototypes, and I noticed that they were able to design a really cool animation or a really neat way of doing a transition between screens. And I thought to myself, like, if I wasn't doing so much testing, I wouldn't have seen that. That's cool the way they did that, or that's a really neat feature. I will integrate something like that into my next project, or it's sort of a sharing of ideas. And if you're shut off, if you're closed off from that, then you're not going to have that experience. And one of the reasons that I've gotten better as a designer over time is just doing more testing, seeing what people are doing, and it allows you to just keep your finger on the pulse of current design and what's really happening out there. And also it's fun, it's enjoyable testing for other people, and it's a good time, and you get to meet your colleagues, and it fosters a sense of community. So I would definitely suggest testing for others as much as you can, and it's a good time. And let's see here. So once you've done your testing, and once you've reviewed your recordings, you will have pages and pages of notes, or whether it's your style to write them down on a legal pad with an actual pen, or you might use Google Docs. You'll need to do something with the information that you come up with. And so organization is the topic here. And how you choose to organize all this information is going to be completely dependent on what sort of information that you're looking for, what sort of information you're not looking for, and the software available to you, as well as how you're going to end up coding things. And so the series of steps here is, as I've alluded to pretty heavily at this point, review all the recordings that you've made. Hopefully you've made recordings. Take notes. Again, this is more my system of doing things. As I stated, I will not take notes while I'm doing my
usability testing or my interviews, I'll then take notes afterward so I'm not distracted by having to write. I can keep my focus on the screen or on the user. And then after I've done taking the notes, I will put everything into Microsoft, or I take notes in Google Docs, but then I'll start to code, and I'll describe what that is in momentarily. And so, again, what sort of information you gather or what sort of data that you're looking for will, of course, be dependent on what sort of hypotheses you are intending to test. And so yours may look different than mine. In fact, I almost can guarantee they're going to. But the things I pay attention to are I make bullet points for likes and dislikes slash pain points, and then I have sometimes I do, sometimes I don't have a third set of bullet points for interesting observations. That's sometimes just an aside remark that the user will make that has no real bearing on what I'm working on necessarily. It's neither good nor bad, but it's something like, oh, I hadn't thought of that. That's worth writing down, and if for no one else but myself, just to look back on it and think like, oh, that might lead to an insight. And so, but again, as far as weighting these things is concerned, I write down the likes. Like if a user said, oh, the choice of background color here is very aesthetic, or I like what you've done with the buttons, and your UI patterns make sense, something like that. I'll write them down, or I'll record them as part of the data organization. However, and it's nice to hear that your design is pleasing to others. However, there's not a lot of weight in that going forward as far as the iteration process is concerned. It's good to know. It's nice that, let's say, for example, the color palette that I came up with works for people and they like looking at it. That's certainly good to know. However, that doesn't tell me anything that I need to do as far as changes are concerned. I'm mostly looking for dislikes and pain points. Those are going to lead to insights, which are going to lead to recommendations. And recommendations is another way of thinking about recommendations is things that need to be changed. And so the things that need to be changed are based on users' dislikes and pain points, and very rarely, for me at least, very rarely are those based on things that they say they like. And likes, while not being terribly, in my experience so far, not being terribly useful for coming up with recommendations, they can be pretty. They can, again, in big type there, big font size, can give you having likes can lead to coming up with metrics toward the end, and that is how to develop questions that can lead to usability testing metrics that you could put on a resume, for example, or in a portfolio, is largely a topic for script writing, usability test script writing, and so I don't want to go too much into that there. But I guess the point of this is if it's interesting, either positive or negative, write it down as far as your data is concerned, because you'll never know what turns out to be useful later on, even if it's not necessarily useful when you're writing your case study. So, and yes, so what do I do with all this data? Part two, and this has to do with coding. And so I do want to point out, and I should have said this at the beginning of this slide here. So as far as organization of findings is concerned, I've been speaking about using Google Docs as my tool of choice for organizing my usability test findings. And that works for me as a lone designer who is doing I think once I did 7 tests per usability testing block, and that worked fine for me. That's enough. That was little enough data that I could handle that on my own, and I could take an afternoon to just organize that and code it. And certainly that definitely works, and Google Docs is an appropriate tool to use when you're working with small amounts of data or you're working by yourself. However, if you are in a team, or you're doing lengthy research, or possibly longitudinal research, or longitudinal testing, or you're collecting diary studies or something like that, you're going to
Google Docs is very quickly going to not be an appropriate tool or app to use for organization of your data. There's just going to be too much data to work with, and it's going to be unwieldy. And so there are professional paid apps and other software out there that you can use that will even automate some of this for you. You just type in, you give the app a transcript of one usability test, and you just keep feeding it transcripts, and it'll think about it for a while, and it'll code automatically. It'll find it'll find pain points or errors in usability from each person and start to code them accordingly. However, again, that's not appropriate for the level of work that I'm doing. And again, Google Docs is just fine. However, do know that those type of systems exist. A lot of them are automated. AI is built into a lot of these to ease the workload of the human user. And so depending on which company you work for or possibly which agency you work for, they may have a subscription to some sort of service like that. So I can't go into those here or yet, as I have no experience with them. However, do know that they exist. And so powerful tools exist, but I can't speak to them. And what I can speak to is my method of coding. And so as we can see here, this is screenshots of sections of 3 different Google Docs that I have. And so when I'm taking notes after the usability test is done and I'm watching the video, when I'm taking my notes, I will have one Google Doc per usability test. So one Google Doc per user that I interviewed. And I will just hit play on the recording, and I will create bullet points or pluses or minuses. Just as they speak, I'll write down, okay, user like this, user didn't like that, said this was a problem, and then maybe a separate bullet point style for interesting insights or things that I didn't expect to see that were neither positive or negative. And then once I am done with that first user, I will sort of, or I will make sure that that Google Doc is as concise as it can be. And then I will move on to the next recording that I have. And I'll start taking the same style of or the same type of notes. However, on the second and every subsequent recording that I review after that, when I start to, at which point I begin to hear users say the same thing. Like if user A, out of all of the comments made, if user A says, oh, had difficulty finding the search bar or was unable to complete a task for whatever reason, and when I see that start to appear numerous times, I will start to highlight those bullet points with specific colors. And the colors don't necessarily mean anything. You can use whatever colors you like and have a system for that. But in this area here, this is from these 2 screenshots are from 2 different users. And if we look at the highlight I made for the issue that is in, I don't know, it was like yellowish, sort of orangish yellow almost. And the first user stated, the contrast of the search field made it difficult to see. And another user said, user did not think the search bar was an input field at first, thought it was part of an image because the search bar or the control for the search was on top of an image, and did not see label. And so these 2 relate to the same issue, that is to say, visibility of the search form. And so I gave those the same color, and I continue to use that color throughout every recording and notes that I went through. And by the end, I had 5 documents, 5 Google Docs, and they were all color. Every usability issue, usability error that came up had a different color code associated with it when it happened more than once. If it was just a one-off, if one user said something that no other user said, then I didn't highlight it just because I didn't want to go crazy with the highlighting for ease of usability, or ease of readability, I should say. And so when I was done writing the notes, having watched the recordings, and having color-coded everything like this, which is my form of coding so far anyway, from that, I counted every instance of a certain issue being presented, and then I, in a separate document, sort of the summation of the summation, or it's a summary of the finding, or it's the synthesis. I called it Issues Roundup, and I said out of 5 user tests, 4 users found the search bar difficult to discover, and I was able to come up with these numbers very quickly by just glancing at all my documents open. I was just looking at the documents and see basically which color do I see more often. And in this case, it was this sort of goldish yellow sunflower color, and I saw that all over the place. And I said, okay, well that color is problem with the search bar. And so 4 out of 5 users had an issue with the way that I presented the search bar, the search form. And so I was able to put that as sort of not necessarily the number one problem. It may be if these were weighted equally, but some problems had a bigger weight than others, regardless of how often that they were mentioned. But I was able to, this is truncated a bit. There were some more usability issues found. However, I didn't want to make a very long screenshot here. And so I was able to summarize the issues I found based on frequency of users indicating that there was an error. And that definitely made it easier to know what to focus on as far as recommendations and what needed to be fixed. And so it cut down, it decreased the amount of time that I had to guess as to what the issues were. And so by taking the time to use color coding here, or by taking the time to code, in this case using colors, I was able to quickly come up with some quants, some quantitative data as to what the issues were, and which in turn led me to, it allowed me to focus on what was most important as to what was the least important. And so this is how I do my coding for now, as I have no need to use a pay service for coding or automated transcription analysis or anything like that. So which would be cool to use. However, this is what I'm using for now. It works for me. Again, there's probably multiple ways of going about doing this. So feel free to look into others or make your own. And the last slide I have here is and after this, after you've done all your testing, all of your rounds of testing are done, and you have your you've come up with your insights and your recommendations based on your coding and all that good stuff, you will make a change or you'll iterate on whatever you're working on. If you have wireframes, you may choose to iterate on your wireframe and retest with new users on a new version of your wireframes, or you might move on to maybe a medium fidelity mockup, or you might move to high fidelity mockups. Or if you're doing usability testing for your high fidelity mockups, you might do another iteration, test again, another iteration, test again, so on and so forth, depending on what your project requires. And so the point, or one of the larger points, one of the big takeaways I want viewers to come away with is test early and test often. The longer you wait to find out something doesn't work, the longer it will take to fix. And that is true for a number of reasons, but a good example I can give you of why that is the case is, let's say that you are, it doesn't matter what fidelity you're working with, but let's say that you're creating wireframes and your prototype is, 20 or 30 screens maybe, and you haven't done any testing, you haven't asked anybody about anything, you've not sought any advice up to that point, and you're ready, you have your prototype ready to go. And let's say that one of the important parts of your prototype that's going to be used frequently, and by that I mean it might be the focus point of one of the goals that you set out for the users to accomplish. It might be part of a task. Let's say that maybe it's a part of a UI pattern. Maybe it's in my case, maybe it's a search field that you didn't do correctly, because I didn't do mine correctly. Let's say that you spend 12, 15, 20 hours working on this prototype, and you start to test it, and you find that users aren't able to accomplish a task or a goal. And so there's big time failure going on with one of your tasks or one of your goals. If you had looked into that further by way of maybe a miniature usability testing, maybe like a 5-minute discussion with someone who is maybe a senior UX dev, or if you just maybe did a little bit of guerrilla testing, you would have found out that this doesn't work, and you were going off a consensus bias that because you knew how to work it, because you were the one who designed it, you assumed it was going to work for everybody. That's not the case. If you had found that out at the beginning of the process, maybe after you've put maybe 2 or 5 hours into your prototype, you could have quickly fixed that, and you could have moved forward with a fresher design, with a better informed idea of how your design should look. But if you find that out at hour 20, when you think you're done with your prototype, or you're ready to iterate, but you need to do your usability testing first, you might find that fixing that is a lot more expensive, either with time or with money, which are, money is a function of time, of course. For example, if I had found out early on that my search field wasn't working before I had made 20 screens, then I could have made a change to that component, or if I could have made a change to that screen, and then after that, it would have been smooth sailing. But if I had found that at the end, closer to the end, that would require a lot more work to fix every single page or to fix every single screen. Everything wasn't a component, of course. However, it required more work than necessary. And a more recent example, because that was from the design sprint, I believe. Yeah, that was from my design sprint. So that was a little while ago. I'm working on capstone, my second capstone right now in this education track. And we have the first capstone, we were allowed to we were allowed to come up with our own idea for an app and then do our own research, so on and so forth. The second capstone, we're given a choice of 5 options. And one of the options, the one I went with, is based on e-commerce. And I chose it for a number of reasons. One of the reasons being I don't know much about e-commerce. Outside of ordering things on Amazon or buying food online, I really don't know how e-commerce works. And because e-commerce is such a large domain, I figured now would be a pretty decent time to educate myself, to become more educated on the inner workings of online retail. And I certainly at the very least in the last week or 2 weeks, I've vastly expanded my knowledge base in that domain. So I'm glad that I chose e-commerce. But one thing that I didn't expect, and this was consensus bias on my part, but I'm glad I tested early, is that some users, and this was pointed out early in the education track, I didn't remember it at the time. Some users, when they go to an online retailer and they're looking for an item, some users will search. Other users will search or they'll go through categories to find what they're looking for. And I think the last time I looked at Statista, or I don't remember exactly what the figure is, but I think about 42% of users will search rather than use categories to find what they're looking for. And I completely forgot about that being a thing. And so when I was in the very early stages of working on my wireframes, I did not include, I had a search field, but I had it hidden behind an icon because I was working in a mobile viewport. And because I'm just finished The Lean Startup by Eric Ries, and he makes it a point to beat the reader over the head with test early and test often, fail early, fail often. And I was really taking that to heart, and still am. And so I thought, every time I have an idea or every time I have an assumption of how the user is going to react or behave, I need to test that. And so I had one screen of a wireframe, maybe 2, and I don't even think anything was clickable at that point. I hadn't added any transitions or animations, and I was working in the office that my wife and I share, and she gets off work about the time I start to do my design work, and so I waited for her to clock out, and I said, could you just please take a quick look at this right quick. And I showed her the prototype in Figma, and I explained what the prototype was for, like, it was for a bike company, so on and so forth, online retail. And I said, I made up a task on the fly, and I said, okay, you're looking for a certain type of bicycle. How would you find that? Just to test a sort of a information hierarchy assumption that I had made about the user. And she looked at the screen for a moment, and God bless her. At this point, she knows, because I'm always asking her to test things for me. She knows that talking aloud is preferred, so I can hear every thought that's going through the mind there. And she said, okay, well, the first thing that I would do is I would try to search. And I thought, oh yeah, that's right. People love searching, because I don't usually search when I go to a retailer. I will just go categorically. And so that's consensus bias for you. And the moment she said that, and that was maybe 45, maybe a minute, maybe even 2 minutes worth of testing from her, I thought, oh, okay, I definitely need to make a search field very, very prominent or more easily discoverable on this page, because she did not see where I had hit it. And looking back at that version, I'm surprised anyone would be ever able to find it, because I was working quickly and I didn't spend too much time make sure my icons and my labels were appropriate. But had I not took that, 2-3 minutes to ask someone who was near me, just, hey, what do you think about this? How would you do this? Just one question of a task, not even a full task. I would have gone forward with a design that wouldn't have worked for at least 42% of the people who I was going to test with. And I fixed that problem based on her just very short amount of input she had there, and I changed it. And I am glad I did that just tiny little bit of a check that I did right then and there about 2 weeks ago, because that has influenced the design going forward. And some of the user feedback I've received so far was positive toward the way that I integrated the search. And had I not done that original check, then it would have been all negatives, because part of the task relied on doing a search, or it could rely on doing a search. The other way of doing it is categories. And so by doing just that small little tiny bit of testing, I tested with my wife, one person, for less than 5 minutes, and that gave me just a lot of information. And that sort of goes back to this chart right here. By testing with that one person, I took care of a really important usability error. And if I didn't, I wouldn't have gotten any insight out of it. And so I would suggest just test everything all the time as you are able to, and as your resources allow, because you will work faster. Well, that's not necessarily true. What is true is you will waste less time. And because a lot of this stuff, especially in the education track, is time blocked, you want to waste as little time as possible. And by that I mean you want to spend as most of your time, you want to maximize the amount of time you work on something that is usable or that is validated, that you won't have to go back and change, because that's basically wasted time that you could have saved by doing some testing. And so that is the point of that little story there. So that is it for this stream this evening. I hope everyone enjoyed this. And of course, if there are any questions about usability testing, moderated, there's also unmoderated testing, which again, that's a separate concept. Or if there's any questions about usability test scripting, anything like that, you can, of course, ask me here on Twitch, find me on Slack, Discord, or Skype, ask me there. And speaking of Twitch, you can subscribe and follow me, and you can also sign up for notifications about when I go live, so you can catch my streams, which are, of course, 7:30 Central Standard Time on Tuesdays and Fridays. And of course, I am always available at any other time. If there's any other UX topics we'd like to chat about, aside from that, I hope everyone has a fantastic weekend, and I will see you next week. Thanks for watching.